Listen up, get ready, I'm not gonna take no more. There's a revolution, a revelation going on in my soul. Buckle up, get ready, we're not gonna sit back.
Okay, we're back. We're back with more live from the Heartland, and it really gives me great pleasure to bring on someone who we've had on the show a number of times, but not for a while. Our very favorite American peace activist, Kathy Kelly. Good morning to all afternoon to you, Kathy.
Hello, Mike. Thank you for having me on the show.
And congratulations on having gotten married. I didn't know that until you told me just before we got on. And now that you're living in the suburbs, that's one less vote that we can try to conjure up for the election. But that's okay. There'll be plenty of opportunities out there for you. Why don't you tell people a little bit about where you were at 20 years ago, this week, and almost to the day, and what was going on?
Well, I was in a small family-owned hotel called Burj Al Fanar on Sharia Abu Nawas in Baghdad. And we knew that something shocking and awful was coming. But I have to say, when the United States aerial bombardment started to use just about every weapon they had in their arsenal, short of nuclear weapons, it was shocking and it was awful. And this family-owned hotel owner had invited his neighbors and all of the staff and their families to fill up the hotel. So it was maybe 5 stories and it was crowded, but there were grandparents and there were toddlers, and even a newborn was born into the community under shock and awe during the bombardment. And you know, I for some reason, it's funny what you remember, but little Dina, she was just as cute as a button and precocious and, you know, going where she wasn't supposed to go. But then you would see her stand and look up at her father with a look of apology, and her father would be so angry. And he wasn't angry with her, he was angry with the bombing because that little girl had lost control of her bladder and was standing in a pool of her own urine. And you know, when you saw how the little toddlers tried to cope with all of these like earth-shattering blasts, it was like earthquake after earthquake, and you know, they'd play games like pretending that they were killed, and then they'd come back to life in your arms and laugh. And that's how little kids cope. You know, they make up things to make it seem as though the worst happens and then something good happens. Little Milada used to use flashlights and pretend they were guns and aim them at her sister and her mother and me. And her mother would be so upset, and you know, I'd be trying to get her to do shadow shows or something else. But I think that was, you know, she would play that game because then she could pretend everybody's still okay. And that's what every parent wanted for their children. They wanted everyone to still be okay. But I don't really have any kind of EMT or first aid skills, but because I'd been in Baghdad longer than others, I'd been going back and forth 27 different trips. The authorities under Saddam Hussein said that if somebody went to the hospital as a doctor or a nurse, they had to have me with them because they knew me. And anyway, I was in the hospital quite a bit during the shock and awe bombing. And again, you can't see a child's body ripped apart and somehow say that child was responsible for Saddam Hussein or deserved to be targeted.
Yeah, I was remembering that when I knew you had been there on this day 20 years ago, I remember that our old friend John Ross, who had visited the Heartland and stayed here with us a little bit before he passed away, but he was there too, and I remember him describing it. Let me ask you, Kathy Kelly, to share with our listeners a little bit about some of the groups that you've been involved with. Voices in the Wilderness, Voices for Creative Nonviolence, and I think most recently, the Merchants of Death War Crimes Tribunal.
Thank you. Well, you know, when we gave ourselves the name Voices in the Wilderness, we did it with some trepidation. Like, it was just such a strange name. And we wanted to name ourselves as a group of people who would openly, publicly, deliberately violate the economic sanctions against Iraq. And that was the right thing to do. The government threatened us with 12 years in prison, a $1 million fine, and a $250,000 administrative penalty. And we wrote back and we said, thank you for the clarity of your warning. We understood these penalties in the first place. We find that we can't be governed by unjust laws that kill children, and we invite you to join us. And so, well, they didn't take us up on the invitation. But when we told our Iraqi friends that our name was Voices in the Wilderness, and we asked, how does that translate into Arabic? They kind of laughed and they said, well, actually, it's a very famous phrase from a poem about a voice that ricochets off the mountains in an echo. It's like a shepherd's yodel, and no one will ever hear it. And I said, oh, well, should we change our name? And they said, no, madame, this is exactly what you are. So that was humbling. So that was our name, and we tried to be, what would I say, a means of education, a means of broadcasting the reality of those economic sanctions. Because, one friend of mine, he was from England, and he looked at the pediatrics ward, and he just murmured, I think I understand. It's a death row for infants, isn't it? A death row for infants. And those economic sanctions, they were sandwiched between the first war in 1991, Desert Storm, and the shock and awe, and they went on and on and on. Those economic sanctions just wrecking the healthcare, the education, all of the things that a society needs so that it would be able one day to overthrow a wrongful, terrible government. I mean, the sanctions guaranteed that Iraqis wouldn't have the strength or the international connectedness or the civil society to be able to oust Saddam Hussein. The sanctions were a wicked imposition. So then we did close the Voices in the Wilderness. We were found guilty, and we said, well, okay, we're not going to pay any fine. And they didn't come and even try to collect. But we opened a new group called Voices for Creative Nonviolence. And with that grouping, we started to expand a bit and go to Gaza and to Lebanon and to Afghanistan. I was unable to enter Iraq. I've been banned from entering Iraq, I'm sorry to say, but after 4 of our friends were held hostage and one of them was killed, the Iraqis said, that's it, we can't protect you from being taken hostage. And so I think in a way it was for our benefit, but they were very clear, no more visas. And then, meanwhile, the war in Afghanistan was almost even more unnoticed than the ongoing warfare in Iraq. So we did get to know a wonderful group of quite young teens. They were 11 and 12 when I first met them. And they were idealistic to the max. They wanted to be involved in cleanup of polluted rivers and in overcoming ethnic differences and outreach to widows and orphans. And they really, as they grew older, they just matured more and more into those values. They were a wonderful group to meet. But just precisely those values and the fact that they welcomed Westerners then jeopardized their lives when the Taliban took over, because the Taliban do not have any time for welcoming Westerners. And they were quite suspect of young people organizing in the ways that these young ones did, because they wanted to overcome gender differences and gender inequalities. They were even very secretly getting bicycles to the girls so the girls can go bicycle riding early on a Saturday morning. And so they were a good group of people. We managed to help 25 of them resettle in Portugal. And 4 are in Germany, a family of 5 in Brazil, and 6 others in Canada. The United States boy, if you weren't working for the U.S. Army or USAID, it's almost impossible to bring somebody into this country. So we told our young friends, write the U.S. off of your list. But there are right now 18 in Islamabad, Pakistan. And that's a precarious situation too.
Yeah,
so we're trying very hard to get them elsewhere.
And you got some of these young people from Afghanistan have gone to Canada as well.
There's a family of 4 in Canada, and then 2 individuals were able to get there. One is in Saskatoon and the other is in Toronto.
Kathy Kelly, let me ask you about both Afghanistan and Iraq and the U.S. policy, and where are we at on both of them? I know you've long talked about double standards in U.S. policy. We know that our military was in both those countries. We played major roles, and we haven't had great outcomes for either country. Give us a little bit about that.
Well, okay, you can't be a pacifist between wars any more than you can be a vegetarian between meals, right? So I'm not going to say, oh yeah, well, in the case of Ukraine, that war is just and that war is necessary. I think wars are always a failure the moment they start. But when you think about Vladimir Putin's wrongful, unjustifiable invasion of Ukraine and the means that he used and the destruction to infrastructure and the endangerment of human lives, what's the difference between that and what the United States did in Iraq and in much of Afghanistan? And then I think, okay, it's wrong to say you can annex 4 parts of Ukraine and say, well, now this is part of Russia. But how hypocritical is it to throw money at the government of Israel when Israel is constantly taking over Palestinian land and persecuting shepherds and farmers and people growing olive trees? And Israel has 200 to 400 thermonuclear weapons. And, the United States has a complete and total double standard. I mean, we supposedly went to war against Iraq thinking Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, which turned out to be a totally fraudulent claim. But meanwhile, we would protect Israel, as it said to the world, we won't be the first ones to introduce nuclear weapons into the Middle East, when in fact, certainly Israel has had and does maintain an arsenal of at least 200, possibly 400 thermonuclear weapons. So those kinds of double standards lower the trust of other peoples all around the world toward us. We can't say, oh, we want to be the beacons of democracy. We want to be the people who broker peace negotiations, and then turn around and say to the premier of China, forget it. We don't like your peace plan because it's not our peace plan. And so I think we have to stop perceiving ourselves as the number one hegemon. And I actually think as human beings, we have to really change our perspective on all of being and not necessarily think that the human beings have a bigger right to resources and planetary existence, because we actually jeopardize planetary existence to the point where there might become ecological collapse. So how do we defend beings from ecological collapse and pandemics and nuclear weapons? Well, I think it's not going to be through throwing all of our money at the Pentagon. The Pentagon doesn't defend us. It endangers us. I think we have to start to collaborate with other countries in very serious ways, seek to pool needed knowledge to overcome pandemics and to deal with ecological collapse, and certainly to prohibit all nuclear weapons.
Well, I like that. That would be great. And I know that you're going to keep working at it, and we'll see what kind of progress we make. I'm wondering if, well, how do we hold the contractors, the government responsible for the weapons that they produce, that they sell? How would we give us some ideas for some action here.
Well, you have to start somewhere, right? And so I'm part of a group now that's certainly wanting to hold all governments accountable, but how about focusing in on the ones that are making so much profit that they practically can own governments? And I'm thinking about Boeing, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and General Atomics. And so we're going to have a tribunal in November. We
You're
welcome
hearing
you
it here first.
Well, and it's going to be putting the merchants of death on trial before a people's tribunal. And I really want to welcome anybody to climb aboard on the preparation for this. It's a lot of work because we need to, particularly with regard to wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Gaza, Somalia, and Yemen, we need to identify what we believe could potentially be called war crimes. And then how are these major corporations aiding and abetting crimes against humanity, war crimes? And which weapons were used, and did the companies manufacture those weapons knowing what the consequence of the use of the weapons might be? So we're putting those 4 companies that I mentioned on trial, and we would certainly welcome any participation from any of the listeners to Heartland Radio.
And TV, we're on CAN TV too. And we're you can watch us at youtube.com/heartlandmedia/videos. So that's why we had you and me both combing our hair before we started. Kathy Kelly, let me ask a little bit more about the Merchants of Death War Crimes Tribunal. You say it's going to be November in 2023. Do you have a date and a place yet?
Well, we want to start on November 10th, and it'll all be online, and there will be episodes successively following November 10th. We'll have a panel of judges that right now includes retired Colonel Ann Wright, Salih Al-Ghazali, who is from Iraq and is just graduated from law school last year, Marjorie Cohn, an international law scholar, Jamu Baraka, who also has international renown. And anyway, so we will have these jurists listening to the evidence that's being presented online. We're going to take the 11th off because that's Armistice Day. We want everybody to be out protesting all wars on Armistice Day.
Right on.
And then we'll resume again on the 12th. And we'll hopefully have all around the world watch parties assembled. And we imagine that by January, the tribunal recommendations will have been issued. The panel of jurists will write their recommendations, and then we have to get to work rolling up our sleeves to enforce them.
Hey, Kathy, what is a website or an email address, some way that people can contact you if they want to get involved?
Just spell out merchantsofdeath.org.
Merchantsofdeath.org. Okay, that's a good one. I got 2 more questions for you. And one of them would be to talk a little bit about Yemen. You know, we know that there's a crisis in Yemen. You have to really dig deep in the news to know what's going on. How about filling us in? And then I got one more question after that.
Well, thank you. You know, people in Yemen, again, people who meant us no harm, are at tremendous risk, not only of U.S. attacks, which have happened whenever the U.S. claims that there's a possible terrorist present, but also the United States has given Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia so many forms of weaponry, so much training, so much cover at the United Nations. And Saudi Arabia has bludgeoned the Yemeni people, attacked infrastructure, caused cholera because of attacking wells that were being dug, attacked hospitals and schools. And yes, the Yemeni Houthi fighters have fought back, and it's actually brought things to something like a stalemate, and there seems to be some possible progress in extending ceasefires. But the siege, the kind of surrounding of the waters and the closure of airports, that is still going on. Saudi Arabia has imposed a state of siege on Yemen since 2015. And this has gone on and on, even though President Biden claimed he was going to put an end to support. That's not what happened.
I mean, what is the status of the Houthis? What are they, religious? Are they leftists? What is their? Can you describe them at all?
I think you could say that they were a tribe of people who became quite strong and would not subordinate themselves to people who had been kind of looting the country for a long time. So they now are a force to contend with, and I don't approve of anybody's militarism or anybody's imprisonment or anybody's torture. I wouldn't say that, this is the good guys, bad guys kind of thing, but I would say that the United Nations should be entrusted with all manner of support to save people from starvation in Yemen right now.
Let me ask you, as we close out this segment on Live from the Heartland, what was your pathway to becoming a peace activist, a pacifist, the person that you've become?
I was really lucky. I finally found my way to a soup kitchen in Uptown. That's what I recommend. Yeah. If you want to get involved and better understand world affairs, find the people who roll up their sleeves and chop the onions and make the vegetables into a soup and offer hospitality to people who might otherwise have no place to stay. Go to a kind of a rundown neighborhood and don't be afraid.
Right on.
Courage is the ability to control your fears.
Well, that's good. And I think that's a nice way to start on your path. But do you have any parting words that you've already kind of inspired us? Do you have a few more things you want to say as we close out?
Well, I think community is very, very important. And I actually want to thank Heartland Radio because for many generations, you've fostered community and you've held on to those values. And I think we should make the most impoverished people in the world our number one priority. And in a way, we do that when we try to live more simply and share resources more radically. So I'm in favor of that too.
Well, Kathy Kelly, you're always an inspiration, and I wish I got to see you more often, but I know on some dental appointment, you'll be wandering around and we'll bump into each other.
All right.
Thanks a lot.